What's up guys, Coach Az here. I want to share a conversation I had with a student of mine last week, and hopefully it can help you to get more out of your coaches. So we were doing sparring last week with my junior class, we're talking teenagers, and at the end of the session, one of the guys came over to me and he simply asked me, Coach, how do I get better? And I paused for a moment because I get this question a lot. It's a very common question for a coach to get asked, but it's actually a really problematic question, mostly because it's just too broad. It's too general. You're not getting into the specifics, and it's very difficult for me to then give you tailored advice to what you need because I don't necessarily understand what you feel you need to improve it. Now I know what it means. You mean you want to get better at fighting in general. You want to have more success in sparring. But to try and approach that from an all-around approach, that's a very daunting task, and it's very difficult for someone to give you, you come over with one question, you want one answer. That's not possible to do. It's a constant process. Rather than me just explaining that to him, I tried to guide him and direct him into how he can ask me better questions to get the relevant information that he actually needs, and also how to do a little bit of self-critiquing, to not be completely reliant on coach to provide the information. Basically, I asked him, what do you mean by get better? What do you want to get better at? He's like, well, I want to get better at sparring. I said, okay, well, let's think about what sparring is. We talk about this in class a lot, so this is already preset. And I said to him, do you want to get better at hitting people or not getting hit? Because effectively, for us as kickboxers, that's the game. The game, we talk about it with the example of football. The game of football, or soccer for Americans, is score goals and prevent the other team from scoring goals. The game of kickboxing is hit your opponent and prevent your opponent from hitting you. The person who hits the person the most at the end of the round or the end of the fight generally wins. So once I re-established that with him, I then asked him, well, which one do you want to improve at today? What were you struggling with in the session? Was it hitting them or was it not getting hit? He said, today I was struggling with hitting them. I felt like I just couldn't hit anyone. I said, okay, what do you mean? Do you mean that you weren't throwing the technique, or do you mean that you weren't reaching them with the technique? Turns out he said that everything he was throwing, he felt was out of range. He never felt like he could get close enough in order to hit his opponent. Okay, great. So now we know very clearly that the issue that you're having is with distance management. It's with closing the distance in order to reach your opponent with techniques. And now I can give you some drills. We can talk about footwork. We can talk about using your jab to measure. We can talk about head movement so that you can get in on the inside. We suddenly now had a conversation that we could have with very specific points on how he could improve. And also what we did was I got him thinking about it and understanding that it's not that he's bad at sparring, he just has an issue. But if your opponent knows and understands that issue, they can make you look very bad. If you watch it in professional fights where someone really pieces someone up, I'll give you a great example. Go watch the Israel Adesanya and Paulo Costa fight. This is a great example. Paulo Costa is a professional fighter. He's training it all the time. He's doing pads, he's doing bag, he's doing sparring. He's, had been in some great fights. The fight with Yoel Romero, great fight. But he came against someone who truly understood his deficits, his issues, the things that he could then take advantage of. So Israel Adesanya ended up making Paulo Costa look like he didn't know how to fight. He made him look like an amateur. But he made him look like an amateur not because he is, I would argue, leagues above him. But really what it was that he very clearly identified what his weaknesses were, what his deficits were, and came up with a game plan in order to take advantage of them. And Paulo Costa, his issue was that in that moment, in that fight, he couldn't make the necessary adjustments. He wasn't able to analyze what was going on the fight and know what to change in order to make that no longer happen. So that's where it kind of gets down to personal coaching. Obviously, in those fights, you go back to your corner in between rounds and you hope that they can guide you and show you these things. But it's really important for us as martial artists to be able to develop that ability to do it for ourselves, within ourselves. Let's take another example, because again, I get these questions all the time. I get asked very often, how can I improve my kicks? And again, you can see the issue. It's just too general a question. You're asking something that's just far too broad for me to give you in a nugget, in one sentence, in one reply, the right information. So you, again, self-analysis, and then we'll analyze it through questioning. What is wrong with your kicks? Well, I don't feel like I can kick high enough. Well, I feel tight around my hips. I don't feel like I can generate enough power. I can't kick fast enough to ever hit anyone. These are all now specific areas where we could look at specific things in order for you to improve. Maybe it's an issue of mobility and you need to take a step back and work on some flexibility, some stretching. Maybe it's an issue of technique, that you're actually making a fundamental mistake and we need to get you on a bag or on a pad and we need you to drill and rep it so that we can iron that mistake out. Maybe it's an issue of strength. You have weak hip flexors, you've got weak glutes that don't activate properly, and your body is compensating by turning you or twisting you another way. These are all very viable options, but we can't get there from simply asking, how can you make my kicks better? How can my kicks improve? A big useful tool when you're coming to speak to your coaches to try and get advice is, before you walk over to them, get a very specific question in mind, because the more specific you are with your questioning, the more specific they can be with their advice, and therefore you'll get a lot more out of it. A couple of things to add to this. Don't be afraid of asking what you believe to be a stupid question. If in your mind you've got this thing that you want to ask coach, but you think it must be obvious, it must be something that everyone knows, and therefore I won't ask it, I'll just try to figure it out for myself. Realize and understand that for coach, it might be obvious. And this is a trap that a lot of coaches fall into. I'm guilty of it all the time. Where for me, doing it for 20 plus years, everything is obvious. You know, the idea of rotating your shoulder in to throw across to put your body weight behind it, for me, very obvious. For beginners, it's not something that they understand or know. It's my job as a coach to identify that they don't understand and see that and to correct it. But as you go through with your training, let's say you're past being a complete beginner, you understand fundamentals, some of these things might be a little more subtle in terms of, you know, the direction you point a foot, or how far round should you bring your hip. So don't be afraid to ask what feels like a pointless or small question, or a very specific question, because these are actually the things that coaches look forward to discussing. It's the minutia, it's the little details. The big thing for everyone is put in the time, right? Be committed to your training, be consistent, and you will see improvement. But whilst we're doing that, if you've got those things in place, you're not turning up randomly once a month and asking a silly question. You're there all the time putting in the graft. The next thing is to iron out all the little mistakes. And that comes from having conversations, coaches watching you, and you asking the questions and trying to fill the gaps within your knowledge. And the last thing I'll say on it is, there's a time and a place for these questions. Sometimes I get asked these questions by people, or I get pulled aside for questioning, and it's like, now's not the time, dude. Like, for example, if you're in a sparring session and coach is gearing the sparring session towards it being quite high intensity, everyone's trying to push, we're trying to get, some people tired, maybe we're prepping some guys for fights, whatever it might be, gradings are coming up, I don't know. And then suddenly in the middle of that, you suddenly want to have a conversation. It's not the time. Save it for the end. Come back at the end of the session when that energy has been, brought back down, everyone's a bit more level-headed, then go to coach with your questioning, okay? If it's more of a technical session and we're drilling, now that's the time. That's a great time to ask the question, because if we're working on a very specific technical drill and you feel that you have a gap in the knowledge and you keep repeating it, what you believe is wrong, then you're going to only ingrain that habit of doing it the wrong way into your mind. We don't want that. So when it's a technical session, if it's a pad session, if you're working on a new technique or a new drill or a new sequence, ask the questions there and then, yeah? But the beginning of the round, ask it as early as possible so that when you go into the round, you know that if you're just drilling it over and over again, that you're ingraining a new good habit into your mind. But if the focus is on something a bit more high intensity, focus on the intensity and collect questions as you go through that you can then ask coach whilst you're cooling down, whilst you're stretching, or on another occasion. Guys, I hope that's been helpful. I hope that will help you to get more out of your coaches, but also how to do a little bit of, like we said, self-coaching and understanding and identifying the issues within your own training. Again, I talk as a striker, but this could apply to grappling, judo, BJJ, wrestling, all of that stuff as well, because this is really just what we're talking about, is principles and fundamentals of coaching. I hope it's been useful. Comment down below, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.